This is a nice handbook for implementing actual flood risk management and disaster risk reduction. It's a long report, so I'll obviously again be very brief. So this is called Urban Flood Risk Handbook, Assessing Risk and Identifying Interventions by City Resilience Program, Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction, and administered by the World Bank. And I will just read key takeaways from each chapter and add a few of my own comments and leave it there. You can follow up with the actual handbook. Key takeaways then: the Urban Flood Risk Handbook offers a practical guide on how to conduct a broad-scale urban flood risk assessment and options appraisal. It's designed for project managers, practitioners, stakeholders, or anyone interested in carrying out a strategic study of urban flooding and potential mitigation solutions. The key takeaways from the handbook are described below by chapter. So a lot of the times risk mapping, risk again is hazard times vulnerability times exposure, and now also response is added, and this is all about how you would respond immediately as a disaster management and recovery, but also in terms of building resilience, especially because interventions must build resilience, and that means you have to have some information about how your flood risk may be evolving in the coming decade or two, because infrastructure investments are for many decades. So let's just jump into it. Defining urban flood risk and scope is chapter 1. A clear understanding of the study's aim and scope from the start is essential and must include early involvement and input from all relevant stakeholders. When you have such a project which has active interventions on lives and livelihoods, you have to co-produce the solutions to have any buy-in at all, because as we will see in a minute, this may include actually moving people or relocating people based on your assessment of flood risk. So that cannot be done unless you have involved stakeholders from the get-go. This includes clearly defining the study's intended audience, the issue or issues it will address, and its geographical extent, recognizing the importance of choosing system boundaries, for example, including the relevant water systems when defining the study area. Conscious and informed consideration must be given to the level of effort versus the overall accuracy and resolution required of the study, recognizing the important trade-offs between the two, but also remembering the law of diminishing returns. So time and cost is what you are talking about here as the two factors that you must focus on in terms of level of efforts. It is easy to get drawn into seeking perfection when simply a good job will suffice. As a practical solution, you don't want to be perfect, because with risks evolving so fast, you don't have the option of being perfect anyways. A balance is often required when prioritizing what to include or leave out during the modeling process and assessment of options, as well as what is required to support the objectives. And cost is a tremendous factor, because not many cities are rich enough to set aside funding for these, and not all national governments will fund urban flood mitigation infrastructure and so on. And World Bank may give you a loan, but this will again come back to planning it properly with stakeholders. So stakeholder engagement then should be central to the flood risk assessment and options appraisal, both to validate the development process and results, and to help ensure uptake and support of the presented options and study outcomes. This is very critical. This engagement includes promoting the importance of integrated flood risk management solutions, and ensuring that urban planning and development decisions incorporate flood risk analysis, which will not only reduce the negative impacts of flooding, but also improve the living environment through as many societal and environmental co-benefits as practical. And remember, we are talking as if there is the luxury of planning the development, whereas often you are retrofitting to a city like Mumbai, which is already sitting on the coast with rising sea levels and extreme rainfall, and it has to retrofit a lot of the things. That is even more challenging, because A lot of the hard infrastructure and buildings that are already there cannot be moved or destroyed. Chapters 2 and 3 focus on flood hazard assessment and flood risk assessment. Floods in urban areas can be caused by a variety of mechanisms, including high river discharges, local rainfall, extreme tides, cyclone-induced storm surges, and severe wave overtopping. So these are very location specific, and each city, urban area needs to map these very well, not only for the present but what's coming next in the next 10 to 20 years. These potential drivers of flooding can occur independently, but several mechanisms can also be strongly dependent. Understanding the drivers of flooding and the possibility of joint occurrence in an urban area is essential in hazard modeling and risk assessment studies. So you have chronic changes like sea level rise, and acute stressors like a thunderstorm coming in or a cyclone coming in and creating multiple hazards together. And if you mix in high tide, it can be a disaster waiting to happen, right? The accuracy of the hazard and risk assessment depends heavily on the quality of underlying data. Data can be expensive and time consuming to collect or purchase and must be considered as early as possible. Local data are always preferable but often hard to obtain in data scarce environments. Freely available global data can be used instead with care, because global data hardly ever comes at a resolution of a city like Mumbai, which is a tiny island city, and global data footprints are large. But the other way to think about it is that these exercises should identify data gaps so that you build resilience along with a very good data network to meet future needs, and not just say we don't have data. Sensible and robust hazard and risk results should be ensured through common sense check at key stages. These checks can be carried out by sufficiently experienced and knowledgeable personnel, particularly when adequate calibration or validation is not possible in data poor environments. Using global data if necessary to validate outputs. Again, this is tricky because of resolution in time and space. Remaining uncertainties in the hazard and risk assessment must be considered when evaluating interventions and clearly disclosed when communicating findings. Okay. Chapter 4, Evaluation of Infrastructure Interventions. This is the trickiest part, not only in terms of time and cost, but also in terms of convincing the stakeholders about the interventions. An open-minded and structured approach to infrastructure interventions should be adopted, considering all potential interventions across the entire gray, green, blue spectrum, as well as non-structural options. So infrastructure comes in these flavors: gray, green, blue. You can follow it up, but I think you have an intuitive sense of what that is. The direct benefits, for example, reduced damage or fewer affected people, as well as the co-benefits of solutions should be evaluated and included. People are often not always aware of the co-benefits that come with these interventions, so you need to provide those details. Hazard and risk modeling shall be set up with this wide range of options and with their benefits in mind, so that these can be tested and evaluated. Interventions should be evaluated against the background of multiple future climate change and socioeconomic scenarios. In this way, robust solutions can be prioritized that can or will be effective in a large range of future situations. This often requires many simulations and can therefore be time intensive, an important consideration during the planning and setup of the hazard and risk modeling process. So here is where academia can really help, unless you have the money to hire consultants who will do the same thing but in a much more costly way, let's say. Finally, full attention should be given to the potential interaction of interventions with each other, considering the possibility of negative impacts as well as cumulative benefits. Also, the environmental and social impacts of solutions should be considered early in the decision-making process to avoid potential pitfalls later. This is always important to avoid unintended consequences after investing a lot of money and time. And resettling people. So potential resettlement and land acquisition are critical aspects to identify early on in this process, because this gets really hairy. Even if you're trying to move people in informal dwellings or slums, unless they are aware from the beginning, it will become real socio-political issue, and all kinds of unintended barriers will arise. Finally, project management issues and closing out these projects and handover with proper guidance and local ownership are very critical. The development of well-structured and informative terms of reference TOR informed by local context is an essential ingredient for a high-quality urban flood risk assessment. It is worth remembering that the TORs should focus on output as much as possible and avoid specifying how to carry out every aspect of the assessment. You want local ownership, and you want to remain a mentor and a supporter of capacity building, etc. This handbook provides some important lessons for developing a TOR document. A varied team is required to evaluate proposals because the multidisciplinary nature of these assessments. Socio-cultural issues are, hardly, can be underestimated in many ways. It can hardly be overemphasized. A clear stakeholder management plan is an important tool in managing any project, particularly where multiple stakeholders may be involved and the technical aspects of the work may be multidisciplinary, as is common with urban flood hazard studies and risk assessments. People may not move when you ask them to move, and they may blame you for what happens after that. So this is a very tricky issue. It's worth making this it is worth making this plan as an early delivery from the consultants, and it should be considered a live document for the duration of the project, updated as necessary as the project progresses. Regular and frequent contact with the consultants and stakeholders throughout the project execution is essential. It's imagined to work in a certain way here with consultants, but it may depend on the city and how rich or poor the city is, and who is funding the flood management, infrastructure planning, risk assessment and implementation. Some cities may be rich enough to do that on their own, but private sector will be involved, in which case acceptable and unacceptable risks should be clearly defined, and risk underwriting depends on that. A private builder has to be responsible for unacceptable risks such as collapsing bridges at every storm, but acceptable risks like a major storm, unpredicted, let's say, versus or an earthquake should can't stay with the government, for example. And there is always the idea of building back better for resilience. A streamlined and thorough internal review process must be set out by the consultants and agreed upon by the clients, with a clearly defined quality control and assurance process. This should include a formal client or stakeholder review and response process, which may involve more than one iteration with a realistic time frame for each work stage or deliverable. Finally, a structured and thorough project closeout phase is essential to ensure the effective handover of all project deliverables, that the investments in data, models and analysis are not lost, and that these deliverables are properly handed over. A properly handled closeout phase allows further development or reuse of the materials and promotes capacity building and continued technical development within local agencies or academia, so the ownership then stays with the local stakeholders and governance. To facilitate this, it's worth specifying the use of free and widely available software with no long-term or costly licensing requirements or implementing constraints. for all technical aspects of the assessment. So you cannot lock in the client into some long-term money-making business in terms of licensing and so on. Okay, so this practical guidance, the practical guidance provided in this handbook will further improve urban flood risk management assessments. The ultimate goal will always be to make the rapidly growing cities of the developing world safer and healthier places for people to live. So health here, flood always brings health issues, especially in hot and wet places like Mumbai, for example. Even without floods, you have lots of health issues coming with the rain, and temperatures breed pathogens, and rain spreads it across, makes it a petri dish. So health is a very important consideration for flood management, mitigation and recovery. Okay, so let's leave this here. It's a nice handbook. You definitely need to read if you're interested in more details. I will leave it here.